Hello everyone, my name is Kyle from Prideful Nerds, and this is the next episode of Nerd Talks, discussing the origins behind Halloween. So guys, before we go ahead and get into the origins, I want to go ahead and explain what Halloween is to people who do not live in many Western nations, because many Western nations celebrate Halloween, but there are many places around the world that do not. So Halloween is a holiday where people dress up, and they go around to doors and they say trick or treat, and usually the people who open the door have a bunch of candy or something that they give to mostly children, anywhere between the ages of anywhere between 5 and 18. And usually when you become an adult, you usually just decorate and you don't really participate too much in the holiday after that. Many people watch scary movies, they dress up in scary costumes or anything that is relevant to anything that's going on or happening in the day. And basically that really is Halloween currently. Many other places in the world, they still celebrate what's called All Hallows Eve, where it's actually majorly a Catholic holiday. This is a holiday where people go to churches and they'll pray for the people who have been long deceased, and they try to pray them out of purgatory. And if you don't know what purgatory is, it's basically limbo between heaven and earth, where a person goes to purgatory to pray off their sins until they enter heaven. And that's what purgatory is. So basically the purpose of All Hallows Eve is to be praying for those people to get out of purgatory. This is majorly celebrated in Scotland, the United Kingdom, or England, and Ireland, as well as Hungary and other places where Catholicism is the majority religion. Halloween is usually celebrated. Oddly enough, though, apparently Italy does not celebrate Halloween too much, even though that is the birthplace of Catholicism. Anyway, so what we want to go ahead and get into, guys, is the origin of Halloween. Where did it all start? Well, Halloween, we can predate it back about 2,000 years ago during the Celtic period. They also pronounce this Celtic, but here in the United States, we pronounce it Celtic. So I'll be using Celtic for the remaining of this video. So basically, the Celtic people celebrated 2,000 years ago a festival that looks like the word, it looks like Samhain, or Samhain. Sometimes the I is in front of the A, but it's actually pronounced Samhain. So the Celts used to celebrate this holiday, which they believed back then, most of the Celts were known as what was called pagan religions. These are the religions that used to celebrate what was called the old god, or the horned god, who created earth through having a intimate relationship with the goddess Gaia, the giver of life, and they had a baby, and the baby was the earth. Now, when a person dies in the Celtic and paganistic religion, basically what happens is you go to this world called Summerland. And Summerland, you're there for a time, depending on how good you were, depends on how long you were in this world. And then over a period of time, in many cases, in many beliefs, you return to the earth as another person. Staying in Samhain or Summerland is not permanent. If you guys want another video going more into what paganistic beliefs are, and more of a description of what the horn god and the goddess Gaia, I did do an extensive study in college on how pagan religions work, and I'd be happy to make another video discussing that topic. But for now, the basics of how paganism works, or the Celtic paganism anyway, I should say, that's basically all you need to know. So for this world, actually for another description as well, when you're in Summerland, you can actually return to the world of the living at certain points in the time, and these are done through either the equinoxes, the summer and winter equinoxes, or also during these other points known as solstices. And these are the time where the moon and sun kind of change, and things like that. This is also known as change in seasons. There are many differences between equinoxes and solstices. I'm not going to go into the differences. Just know that Samhain is a celebrant of the fall or autumn solstice. Now, the night of October 31st, which is when Halloween is celebrated, they believe that the world of the living and the spirit world become intertwined. For one night, they actually become one. And this is the time where you can speak to your loved ones who have been deceased and gone to Summerland. And basically, The thing as well with this is that this can also bring horrible things, because there is also a demonic world in paganism, and the world of Summerland and this evil world and the world of the living are all intertwined. So for this, you need a sense of protection. Now, this sense of protection is done through carving into a gourd a spooky face that you would also light a candle into and put it out on your front doorstep. Does this sound familiar to those of you who celebrate Halloween? It's the jack-o'-lantern. Obviously, the pumpkin is a New World thing, so in Europe at this time, they didn't have pumpkins. What they did have was gourds, white, small gourds. They were squashes in the Western world, and they would carve these gourds and put them out on their front doorstep. And what this would do is deter any evil spirits from entering your home. Now, the downside of this is apparently also scares off the good spirits. So if you're wanting to actually talk to a spirit that you want to contact, like let's say like a father or mother, you would have to go see a shaman or a local druid in order to contact these, or you hold your own festivals, but you have to do it in your backyard, not in the house, because you also want to protect your house from the evil spirits. Now, they wouldn't just do this at their homes. They would also light gourds, and they would also decorate scarecrows in the fields, because they also believed that these evil spirits would damage crops. It was kind of a mixed holiday. It was a holiday where people celebrated and also were very afraid, because they didn't want the evil spirits affecting them in any way. So what they would also do is they would also dress up. They would wear gourds on top of their head if one was big enough. They would also dress up in spooky costumes and things like that. This was in order to deter evil spirits from affecting them. They're trying to scare them away from their villages. This celebratory would also happen as well on the eve of the 30th, which was called All Hallows Eve. And this is when they would also celebrate, because they basically were doing... this really wasn't a celebration. This was a precautionary ritual that the Celts would actually perform in order to prevent the spirits from entering the village if they were able to bless them. But you would still have to decorate your home and put gourds out in front of your house, because sometimes the ritual apparently didn't work, and plagues and things would be spreading around, and if someone got sick, they would blame it on Samhain, and they would blame it on the spirit worlds coming intertwined. Now, another thing that they did for Samhain is that they would also try to use this time to bless their village. In the midst of all this chaos, they were trying to get blessings from Summerland and from Gaia. And what they would do is the priests would actually make predictions of the future depending on if any negativity happened in the village during the time of Samhain. And nothing bad happened to your village, or if some weird omen happened, they can actually say that they would be able to predict the future and predict if they were going to have a rough winter or not. They would also perform huge bonfires where people would gather around. They burn crops. They'd also sacrifice animals to other Celtic deities, basically the Horn God and Gaia at this time. There were some other minor gods at this time, but they're not really worth going into at this moment unless you want me to go into a deeper thing about paganism, which I would be happy to do, because this stuff really interests me. What they would do is that they would light this all day long, and what they would also do is they would relit their hearth fires. Now, their hearth fires are places of, these were the kind of like the Druid temples and Druid sacred sites. They would actually dim them out for the day, and then at night they would relight the hearth fires. And what these hearth fires would do, they were supposed to be wards against evil spirits. They would actually turn them off, because if they turned off the hearth fires, if they turned them off, they'd be able to contact the spirits of Summerland, because this would actually repel all spirits, not just bad ones. But they would do is they would relight it at the All Hallows Eve, the night of the 31st, and this would prevent any demons or anything like that from affecting them. But what they would also do is when the hearth fires were off, they would actually try to gain sacred blessings from Gaia to bless their crops, so they would have a good winter. Obviously, in the Western world, in Europe, winters are very harsh, and this was their way of trying to prevent winters from being very, very harsh, is they would use this event, and they would also use the celebration of Yule, which was Christmas, in order to prevent a harsh winter. Even though Yule is done in December, this was more meant to kind of celebrate and try to get over the dulls of winter. It was more of a party than a blessing, but they did blessings at that time as well. So around 40 A.D., this is around the height of the Roman Empire. The Romans were starting to convert to Christianity. They basically, during this time, the Romans conquered much of the Celt world. And at this time, they turned a lot of this event. The Romans kind of brought in some new things. They brought this in and they took it more from a religious, paganistic event to more of a party. And the Romans basically, they started doing things like, bobbing for apples. They'll make, fairs and things like that, and they made it more of a celebrant of the harvest, the time of the harvest, taking away from more of the scary and the horrors of it. Because really at the time, the Romans didn't really believe too much in evil spirits. They were more of, there are gods, and the gods are either good or they're bad. And the whole demonic thing, they weren't all about that. They didn't want to focus on that. They wanted to focus on the good and the partying as much as the Romans did. The Romans loved to party, as many people who like to study history know. The Romans like partying. They like conquering, too. That's another thing they like to do. But basically, what the Romans did is they introduced a lot more newer things to it. A lot of the Irish Isles, which the Romans really weren't able to get into too much, and neither were they able to get into Scotland. They just built a wall to keep the Scots out. A lot of Ireland still celebrated things in the old ways. They still did the gourds and all that kind of stuff to prevent it, but they weren't trying to go out and relight hearth fires and bonfires. The Romans actually took the bonfire idea and they said, hey, this is really cool. This would be a cool party thing. And what they would do is they would actually burn, instead of burning animals and sacrificing animals, they didn't really do that too much anymore. The Romans sacrificed animals, but they kind of got rid of it out of the Celtics Samhain celebratory events. They got rid of that, and what the Romans actually did is that they just used the time to burn old furniture and just to make the fires as big as possible. And they would drink and do fair things and bob for apples and all that kind of cool stuff. So bobbing for apples actually came from this Roman idea. The Romans bob for apples. So you can think when you go to a Halloween circus or a Halloween fair and you won't go and bob for apples, you can thank the Romans for this because they were the ones who invented it. So jumping about 500 years, or well, actually 600 years more, around 600 A.D., a lot of this Halloween or Samhain celebratory things spread all throughout Europe. And the idea of celebrating Halloween hit the now rising Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was doing its best to try to bring salvation, in their eyes, to the north. They were trying to go into Norway. They were trying to get into Sweden, Denmark, especially the British Isles. And the Catholic Church had the hardest time trying to convert the Celts to Catholicism. And the way they started doing this is they started changing and adapting into the pagan holidays. Because what would happen is that these people would convert, but they would still celebrate the pagan rituals, and the Catholics did not like this. They were trying to do their best to change this event. So what the Catholics did is the Catholics decided to embrace this holiday, and instead of trying to contact the dead, they used they used purgatory. They said, okay, well, instead of you guys trying to contact the dead and using what they in their eyes was necromancy, you could just adapt this holiday and make it for a day where you pray for the dead. You pray for the dead to get out of purgatory. Now, a lot of this was also coming out of a lot of the pagans who were really rejecting Christianity were actually using Catholic missionaries as sacrifices during Samhain. And the Catholics were not liking this. So what they did is they said, okay, let's try to adapt the holiday to keep the priests from getting burned alive during the Samhain bonfires. Because you got to remember, a lot of these holidays were actually used as anti-Roman propaganda, I guess you want to say. It was an anti-Roman thing where basically instead of... because they didn't like the idea of Romans trying to change their tradition. So a lot of these very resistant to change tribes in Ireland and Scotland and different parts of Europe, they basically were still doing the old way of celebrating Samhain, and instead of sacrificing animals, they started going after Romans and Roman Catholic priests. So they tried to do this to adapt. And overall, this actually did really well. The Catholics were very successful in changing the way Halloween was done. And by the end of the century, around 730 AD, they were able to successfully change the grand majority of Samhain. And Samhain became All Hallows Eve, or Halloween, or Hallowen, pronounced in some certain Celtic areas. I know there are many parts of Scotland where they call it Hallowen. So basically what happened now is that these people were, instead of praying to the dead and things like that, they were trying to pray for the dead to get out of purgatory. So they were able to successfully change it and adapt. And the Catholics were very successful in this with Samhain and in Yule, because they basically changed that to Christmas, and they also changed a certain other holiday and changed it into Easter. They were able to convert a lot of these pagan holidays and make them Christianized. Now, obviously, there are some resistance to this, and a lot of Samhain has actually seen a big resurgence in Europe, and people tend to celebrate this, but a lot of the religious spirit things are taken out. Really what Samhain is that it's an excuse for Europeans to light a big bonfire legally and celebrate it. So they don't really celebrate the paganistic Samhain. They just have taken on more Samhain practices in Europe today, because a lot of the times in Halloween, you don't light bonfires. They got rid of the bonfire thing. People still celebrated it, but the Catholics kind of ignored it. People still did the gourd thing. They also started having a tradition where children would go out to different people's houses to get treats. And with these treats, they would also write biblical verses. They'd write things that popes have said. And they also went to different churches and towns. And the Catholic priests would come out and they would give a treat to the children. And that's where the whole term trick or treat came in during this time, because a lot of people would say, hey, trick or treat. This was a paganistic thing of either the spirits are going to trick you. If you open up the house to us, we're either going to trick you or you can give us a treat and we'll go away. And that's where the term trick or treat came in. It still stuck around because the Catholics didn't really know what it meant. And to be honest, I don't think the Catholics really cared, as long as people weren't praying to the ancestors and they were praying to God instead. So the Catholics didn't really care how that worked too much. Now, this was celebrated in Europe all the way through from around 700 AD all the way up until, well, today, obviously. And it's still Christianized a little bit, but the majority of the time now this has become more of a commercial thing where people go out and they buy candies and, kids run around and stuff like that. But in Europe, a lot of the Catholic nations still celebrate it the old Catholic way. Now, here in the U.S., because we love to marketize things, we love to make profit off of nearly everything. Not saying that's wrong, but that's what we do. Halloween was never really celebrated here in the U.S. until the 40s. 1948, really, to be specific, is when you started seeing ads from candy companies saying, hey, buy stuff for Halloween, and they started appearing in magazines. And this really has to do with World War II. When the troops from the U.S. came over to Europe in World War II, they started seeing these different holidays, and Halloween was one of them. And a lot of these soldiers kind of thought the idea was cool. So that in order to look cool when they came back, they started talking about how this whole Halloween thing, and the U.S. started celebrating it. Really predating back from 1940, early time America, Halloween wasn't really celebrated. It was kind of a quiet Catholic holiday for the Scottish and the Irish and the Germans that were coming over and immigrating into the U.S. A lot of people were celebrating it, but it just wasn't really too big of a deal. A lot of the ideas of Halloween were really kind of turned away in England, which is where the majority of people who came over here from the U.S. originally were from. They kind of turned away from it after Henry VIII banned himself from the Catholic Church and formed the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Halloween was kind of looked down upon as a Catholic holiday, and it really wasn't picked up again until the late and mid-1800s, and you started seeing a resurgence in the celebratoriness of Halloween that time. But during the 16th, 17th, and early 1800s, it was really looked down upon. So many English people did not celebrate Halloween for about 200 years. There was a dark spot at that point. So really, Halloween was kind of a quiet holiday that really wasn't spoken about too much. until the 40s. And it became commercialized. It was more about buying costumes, decorating, purchasing decorations, purchasing candy, and things like that. The religious notion of Halloween was not celebrated too much in America at all. Now, here in the U.S., if you are a Catholic, you could still go to Catholic service and Catholic masses here in the U.S. to celebrate Halloween in the old way. But really, in the public sphere, it's just mostly about getting candy, kids decorating up and things, and for girls about 14 and up to dress up in the most sluttiest thing possible. I don't understand that, but that's just become so popular here in the U.S. I don't quite understand it. I don't complain in girls over 18, but, you know, if you're younger than that, what the fuck are you doing? So anyway, that is really the history of Halloween. There really isn't too much more to go into. It's just really interesting to see how the paganistic ideas really still are shown today. The whole jack-o'-lantern thing, the whole dressing up, that is coming straight 2,000 years ago. Obviously today now it's more commercialized, unless you're in certain parts of Europe where it's still celebrated in the old way, or you can also see in parts of Europe where actually the pagan thing is still going on. The praying to the ancestors is really not big in Europe anymore, but you could still see where people are lighting the bonfires, people are dressing up in old costumes like they used to back in the day, and still making the carvings out of the old gourds rather than using pumpkins, even though pumpkins is more the big thing we use now. And the pumpkin idea really just came out of America because it was actually a way the pumpkin farmers can get a good deal, because selling pumpkins back here in the U.S. Was kind of a hurting market, and in order to boost the market here in the U.S., they actually started advertising, instead of using gourds, which are more expensive, you can use a pumpkin and you can do more different carvings. And really the reason why pumpkin spice and things like that became a huge big thing was due to Halloween. It was due to people buying these things, and they all of a sudden decided people were wasting the insides of the pumpkin, and they're like, I wonder how we can use this, and they started making pumpkin pies and things like that. This really didn't take off until the celebratoriness of Halloween from 1948. So you can thank the commercialized people and the market to basically try to celebrate Halloween to make a profit. The reason why people are so crazy about pumpkin spice and stuff like that is really thanks to this event. People picking up Halloween and the pumpkin farmers trying to get a bigger lobby in the market, and they basically started pushing to have pumpkins sold instead of gourds for carving things, which worked. A lot of people did it, and because the pumpkin had a bigger face, you can carve different things, and then all of a sudden people realized that, hey, pumpkins actually taste pretty good, and the market just boosted. And that's why every year now we sell almost 2 billion tons, or 2 billion tons, 2 billion pounds of pumpkin is sold here in the U.S. each year, thanks to this event. So anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Nerd Talks. I know it's a really different subject. I just thought it would be kind of cool to talk about the history of things. If you guys want me to touch on another subject, please let me know down below. If you guys want me to talk more about kind of like paganistic religions and the ancient religions, I'd be happy to do that. I took advanced religious studies in college where we got to touch on a lot of these subjects. So I have a lot of knowledge on how this stuff works. And that's really how I got into the interest of the history of Halloween, was when I was celebrating, reading into the different paganistic religions in Europe. I stumbled upon the ancient pagan holidays, and all of a sudden I realized that these all connected. I just wanted to kind of share that with you guys. So anyway, guys, I will see you all in the next video that I make.